The wind in the Montana Territory had teeth. In the winter of 1876, it bit with a particular vengeance, sweeping down from the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Absaroka Range and scouring the single, muddy artery of Silver Mercy. The town was less a community and more a raw intersection of necessity, a place where the stagecoach line crossed paths with the newly strung telegraph wire, both cowering in the shadow of the Frontier Saloon. Life was hard scrabble, governed more by the coming snows than by the loose weave of the law. Each gust of wind smelled of pine, damp horse leather, and the cold promise of isolation. From the window of her small clinic, Dr. Eliza Hart watched the last of the daylight bleed from the sky, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. The glass was cold against her fingertips. Outside, a single oil lamp swung on a wrought iron bracket above her door, its small, defiant flame tossing shadows that danced like ghosts in the wind. It was a meager light against an overwhelming darkness, but it was hers. For a woman of 25, raised and educated in the gaslit propriety of Boston, this small flicker felt more like home than any place she had ever known. She turned from the window, the chill of the frontier still clinging to her. Her clinic was a testament to order and discipline amidst chaos. Jars of tinctures and salves were arranged in neat rows on clean pine shelves. Bandages were rolled with a precision that bordered on art. Her surgical instruments, polished to a high gleam, lay on a linen cloth, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn walls of the building. Here, she was not just Eliza Hart, the unmarried woman who had traveled west alone, a subject of endless gossip. Here, she was Dr. Hart, a mender of broken things. The townsfolk had another name for her, one she had overheard Tommy Pike, the talkative stagecoach driver, using with a good-natured chuckle. The Virgin Doctor. It was a label spoken with a mixture of teasing curiosity and a strange, almost grudging, respect. It set her apart, creating a barrier of mystique that, while isolating, also served as a kind of shield. It meant no man in the saloon dared to be too familiar, and the town's more pious wives treated her with a cautious deference. Eliza endured the name as she endured the wind, a constant, irritating pressure she had learned to ignore. Her purpose was not to marry, but to heal. She had come to this raw edge of the world to save lives and, in doing so, to build a life of her own. A home forged not from family or familiarity, but from her own two hands. The silence of the clinic was broken only by the creak of the floorboards and the ceaseless moan of the wind. It was a lonely sound. She had treated the usual ailments of the frontier, a miner's cough that rattled deep in the chest, a ranch hand's hand mangled by rope, a child's fever that burned with a terrifying heat. But lately, a new kind of injury had appeared. Bruises that looked suspiciously like they came from a fist, gashes that were not quite accidental. These injuries were often attached to men who worked small plots of land in the valley, land that Magnus Barrow, the magnate behind the new railroad and the silver mines, wanted for himself. The steel tracks of his railroad, still raw and smelling of creosote, were a physical scar on the landscape, a symbol of a brutal kind of progress that enriched a few by displacing many. Barrow's lawyer, a man with a serpent smile named Ezekiel Voss, had been tacking notices to doors, legal papers filled with dense language that all meant the same thing: get out. Eliza picked up a roll of cotton gauze, the clean, soft texture a comfort in her hands. She thought of the people she had met, people whose lives were as fragile as this thin fabric. Sister May, the nun who ran the soup kitchen with a faith as sturdy and practical as her iron pots, had spoken of the growing fear among the small ranchers and the Crow people, who were being squeezed from their ancestral lands. She had seen the weight of it in the eyes of Sheriff Alma Reyes, a woman of sharp intelligence and deep integrity, trying to uphold the law in a town where Magnus Barrow was quickly becoming the law himself. The sheriff was a good woman, of that Eliza was certain, but she was caught in a tightening vice between Barrow's money and her own conscience. A sudden, sharp rap on the door made her jump, the gauze falling from her hand. It was not the polite knock of a townsperson. It was urgent, heavy. The town had an unofficial curfew, a shared understanding that respectable folk were indoors after dark, especially with the threat of snow hanging in the air. This was well past midnight. She hesitated for only a second, her duty overriding her caution. Picking up an oil lamp, she unlatched the heavy wooden door. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair across her face and threatening to extinguish the flame. A man stood on her doorstep, a massive silhouette against the churning gray sky. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his shoulder. Even in the flickering light, she could see the dark stain spreading across his heavy wool coat. "Can you help?" His voice was a low rumble, strained with pain. "Get inside," she said, her tone all business. She stepped back, holding the lamp high. He stumbled in, and she quickly shut the door, bolting it against the storm. The man was tall and powerfully built, with the wide shoulders and weathered face of someone who lived his life under the open sky. His dark hair was matted with sweat and melting snow. As he turned, the lamplight fell on his face, and Eliza recognized him. Colt McKinnon, a cattleman, a guide, a man who kept to himself. She had heard the whispers about him, too, that he had once ridden with the notorious Red Jack gang but had walked away. Now, he hired out his gun to protect cattle drives, a solitary figure who seemed to be at war with his own past. He was not a man who sought trouble, yet trouble had clearly found him. "Let me see," she said, her voice calm and steady. He grunted and allowed her to help him out of the heavy coat. The wool was soaked through with blood. Underneath, his shirt was a ruin, torn and sticky. The wound was on his left shoulder, a long, angry furrow where a bullet had grazed the flesh and muscle. It was not a clean shot, but it was deep and bleeding freely. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the sturdy wooden chair beside her examination table. Colt moved slowly, his face a mask of stoicism, but she saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the tightness around his eyes. He sat without a word, his gaze sweeping over the tidy clinic, a flicker of something like surprise in his eyes. Eliza went to work. She washed her hands with carbolic soap, the harsh scent a familiar comfort. Her movements were efficient, wasting no motion. She clipped away the torn fabric of his shirt, exposing the full extent of the injury. The flesh was raw and torn. It would need to be cleaned thoroughly and stitched. "This will hurt," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a clean cloth. "Everything hurts out here, Doctor," he said, his voice quiet. She pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth to the wound. He hissed through his teeth, his entire body going rigid, his hands clenching into massive fists on his knees. But he did not cry out. He just breathed. Long, slow breaths, as she meticulously cleaned the wound, picking out tiny fragments of wool and dirt. She worked in silence, aware of his presence in a way that was different from any other patient. It was not just his size, which seemed to fill her small clinic, but a stillness about him, a coiled energy held in check. His hands, though clenched, were calloused and capable, the hands of a man who worked hard. She found herself thinking that they were hands that knew how to be gentle despite their strength. "Who did this?" she asked, her focus entirely on her work as she threaded a needle with sterilized horsehair. He was quiet for a long moment. "A stray shot," he said finally. Eliza paused, looking up at him. His eyes, a deep, guarded gray, met hers. He was lying. She had seen enough gunshot wounds to know the difference. This was no accident. This was a message. "There are a lot of stray shots in this valley lately," she said, her voice neutral. "Most of them seem to fly in the direction of anyone who won't sell their land to Magnus Barrow." A muscle worked in his jaw. Barrow's men were trying to spook a homesteader's cattle. I was in the way. So it was as she suspected. Another piece of Barrow's campaign of intimidation. She began to stitch the wound, her fingers moving with practiced skill. The needle dipped in and out of his flesh, pulling the ragged edges of skin together. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "You have a steady hand, Doctor," he said, his voice softer now. "They probably don't teach you how to sew up a cow hand in those fancy Boston schools." "Cows complain less than you do," she retorted without looking up, a faint smile touching her lips. The tension in the room eased slightly. She finished the last stitch and tied it off, her work neat and clean. As she prepared a bandage of cotton gauze and linen, another knock echoed through the clinic. This one was different. It was loud, authoritative, the sound of a fist wrapped around a lawman's nightstick. Colt tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun belt he had unbuckled and laid on the floor. "Stay still," Eliza ordered quietly. "You will tear my stitches." She walked to the door, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. She looked through the small peephole she had insisted the carpenter install. Sheriff Alma Reyes stood on her doorstep, her face grim in the lantern light, and beside her stood one of Barrow's hired guns, a man named Finch with cold, empty eyes and a smirk that was a permanent fixture on his face. Eliza opened the door, but only a few inches, blocking the entrance with her body. "Sheriff, can I help you?" "Evening, Dr. Hart," the sheriff said, her voice strained. "We have a report of a disturbance up near the Miller homestead. Gunfire. We're told Colt McKinnon was involved. We need to take him in for questioning." Finch pushed forward slightly. "He is a troublemaker, Sheriff, a known associate of criminals. Best we lock him up before he causes real harm." Eliza's spine stiffened. She looked past the sheriff to the smug face of Barrow's man and felt a cold anger rise within her. She knew exactly what this was. They were not here to investigate. They were here to arrest the man who had dared to get in Barrow's way. "Mr. McKinnon is my patient," she said, her voice clear and ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. "He has a gunshot wound that I have just finished treating. He is in no condition to be moved, and he will certainly not be spending the night in one of your cold jail cells." Sheriff Reyes had the decency to look conflicted. "Eliza, this is official business. I have to—" "You have to nothing," Eliza interrupted, her gaze unwavering. She opened the door wider, revealing the clinic behind her, the examination table, and Colt sitting in the chair, watching the exchange in silence. She stood planted in the doorway, a small woman in a plain dress, a barrier of pure, unyielding will. She looked directly at the sheriff. "My patient is under my care. If you want to take my patient, you will take the operating table with him. Now, unless you have a medical degree I am not aware of, I suggest you let me do my job." Finch sneered. "Listen to the little doctor, playing nursemaid to a fugitive." The sheriff held up a hand, silencing him. She looked at Eliza, at the fire in her eyes, and then at Colt, who sat perfectly still. Alma Reyes was a woman who understood the currents of power in Silver Mercy. She knew this was Barrow's doing, and she saw in Eliza's stance a line being drawn in the dirt. For tonight, at least, she knew which side of it she needed to be on. "He can stay the night," the sheriff said, her voice firm, "but I will post a deputy outside, and I expect to speak with him in the morning. McKinnon, first light." Colt gave a slow, single nod. Finch started to protest, but the sheriff shot him a look that could have frozen fire. "That is my decision. Finch, you can tell your boss that." She tipped her hat to Eliza. "Doctor." Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps heavy in the snow that had just begun to fall. Finch lingered for a moment, his eyes filled with malice, before spitting on the ground and following her into the darkness. Eliza closed the door and leaned against it, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving her feeling shaky but resolute. She had crossed a line. Her small clinic, her sanctuary of healing, had just become a battleground. She turned and looked at Colt McKinnon. He was watching her, his gray eyes no longer guarded, but filled with a profound, raw respect. The wind howled outside, and the new snow began to fall in earnest. blanketing the raw little town in a sheet of white, covering the tracks and the scars, at least for a little while. Inside the clinic, the single lamp burned steadily, a small promise of warmth in the heart of the storm. For the first time, Eliza felt that home was not just the place she had built, but the stand she had just taken. The silence that fell after the door was bolted was heavier than the storm. For a long moment, Eliza and Colt simply looked at each other across the small, lamp-lit room. The scent of carbolic soap, whiskey, and blood hung in the air. Outside, the wind shrieked, a wild counterpoint to the quiet intensity within the clinic walls. Colt broke the silence, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "You did not have to do that." "Yes," she replied, turning to tidy a tray of instruments that was already perfectly neat. "I did. You are my patient. That was more than doctoring, and you know it. You stood up to Barrow's man." He watched her, his gaze missing nothing. "You have a spine made of iron. Doctor." Eliza felt a warmth creep up her neck. She was not accustomed to such direct praise, especially from a man like him. In Boston, her determination had been called stubbornness, her focus unladylike. Here, this quiet man with a dangerous past called it strength. "Iron rusts," she said, her voice brisk to cover her unease. "Now sit still. I need to check the bandage one more time before I can allow you to rest." She approached him again, her movements all professional efficiency. But as she leaned in to inspect her handiwork, she was acutely aware of him as more than just a collection of symptoms. She felt the heat radiating from his body, saw the fine lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. His hands, which had been clenched into fists of pain moments before, now rested on his knees, relaxed and open. They were large, calloused hands, yet she remembered how carefully he had moved when he entered her clinic, how his large boots had found the floorboards with a surprising gentleness, as if he were afraid of breaking something. He was not, she realized, a man of casual violence. Whatever darkness was in his past, it had not extinguished a core of decency. He watched her fingers as she adjusted the linen bandage, her touch light and sure. "Thank you." "Eliza," he said, his use of her first name startling her. "For the stitches." And for the door. She finished her work and stepped back, creating a careful distance between them. "You can rest in that chair for the night. I have a spare blanket. In the morning, you will speak to the sheriff, and then you will be on your way." He simply nodded, accepting her terms without argument. She retrieved a thick wool blanket from a storage chest and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed, a brief spark of contact that sent a jolt through her. She pulled her hand back as if burned. She bid him a clipped good night and retreated to her small living quarters at the back of the clinic, separated by a heavy curtain. But sleep was a distant country. She could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing from the other room, a steady, living presence that filled the lonely spaces of her home. The label the town had given her, the Virgin Doctor, echoed in her mind. It had always felt like a brand, a way of defining and dismissing her. In the lecture halls of her medical college in Boston, surrounded by a sea of disapproving male faces, she had been an anomaly, a hen medic, as one professor had sneeringly called her. She had come west to escape that judgment, to be defined solely by her skill. Instead, she had found a new label, one that focused on what she had not done rather than what she could do. Yet tonight, standing in that doorway, she had not felt like a curiosity. She had felt like a fortress, however small. And the man sitting in her clinic had seen the steel, not the speculation. Long after midnight, she sat at her small table, mending a pair of deerskin gloves by the light of a low-burning lamp. She had fashioned them herself from a hide traded from a trapper. They were softer than cowhide, more pliable for the delicate work she often had to do. Yet they were still a skin between her and the world, a thin membrane to keep the blood and the grime and the raw. aching sorrow of this place from seeping into her own flesh. They were a fragile barrier, and tonight she felt as if that barrier had been breached. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the window, painting the room in shades of gray, she found Colt awake, staring into the dying embers in the potbelly stove. He looked tired, but the lines of pain on his face had eased. "I am making coffee," she said, her voice sounding loud in the stillness. I would not say no to that. She worked the hand grinder, the rasping sound filling the quiet. They did not speak as she brewed the coffee, but it was a comfortable silence. She handed him a tin mug, and he took it with a murmur of thanks. She watched him cradle it in his large hands, the steam rising to wreathe his face. He took a sip, his eyes closing for a moment in simple appreciation. "It has been a while since I had coffee that did not taste like boiled dirt," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It is one of the few luxuries I insisted on bringing from the East," she admitted, sipping from her own mug. They sat like that for a while, two solitary people sharing a small circle of warmth as the town began to stir outside. A deputy, true to the sheriff's word, was visible through the window, a lonely figure stamping his feet to keep warm. The quiet moment was a truce, a temporary peace before the day's battles began. It was a fragile seed of something she could not name, planted in the dead of night, and she was not sure if she should be afraid of it growing. The day brought the world rushing back in. Tommy Pike, the stagecoach driver, was her first visitor, his face red from the cold and bursting with news. "Morning, Dr. Hart," he boomed, shaking snow from his hat. "Town is buzzing like a beehive in a bushfire. First, the sheriff faces down one of Barrow's thugs right on your doorstep, and second, that snake Voss has been out since sunrise. He is tacking these official-looking notices on every door from here to Sunday. Land seizure warnings, he calls them, says the railroad needs the right-of-way." Eliza's heart sank. "He cannot just do that." "Seems he can," Tommy said, his usual cheerfulness dampened. "The church got a healthy donation for its building fund this morning, and the saloon got a delivery of whiskey that would float a battleship. Barrow is buying silence, and I hear the town council is putting pressure on Sheriff Reyes to keep the peace," which is Barrow's way of saying, "A look the other way." He leaned in conspiratorially, but not everyone is taking his coin. Sister May over at the kitchen said her pantry is open to anyone who needs it. And, well, if you find yourself needing any special medicines brought in, or supplies moved quiet like my stagecoach makes regular runs. No charge for friends of justice. Eliza felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Tommy. I will remember that." After Tommy left, the day settled into its familiar rhythm, yet everything felt different. Her clinic was no longer just a place of healing, it felt like an outpost. A miner came in with a hand that had been crushed between two ore carts, his fingers a mangled mess. As Eliza carefully cleaned the wounds and set the broken bones into a splint, she worked with a fierce, protective focus. This man's hands were his livelihood, his family's future. Magnus Barrow saw these people as obstacles, as faceless workers to be used up and discarded. She saw the grit under their fingernails, the worry in their eyes, and the quiet dignity of their struggle. Colt remained in the clinic, mostly silent, watching her work. He moved only to put another log on the fire or to fetch her a bucket of clean water from the well, his movements economical and unobtrusive. He saw how she spoke to the gruff miner, her voice gentle but firm, explaining what she was doing, calming his fear. He saw the respect the man gave her, a respect earned not by her gender or her background, but by her undeniable skill. He had come west to escape his past, to live a quiet life where he did not have to choose sides. But watching Eliza Hart, he felt the pull of his own conscience, a force as strong as a river's current. He could not stand by and watch Barrow crush these people, and he could not leave this woman to stand against them alone. Late in the afternoon, a new figure appeared at the edge of town, a man who moved with the fluid grace of a hunter. It was Gray Fawn, a crow tracker Colt had known for years. He did not approach the clinic directly but waited by the livery stable. A silent signal. "I will be back," Colt said to Eliza, his voice low. She watched from the window as the two men spoke. Gray Fawn used few words, gesturing with his hands toward the hills where Barrow's mining operations scarred the land. The conversation was brief, but when Colt returned, his face was set in grim lines. "What is it?" she asked. "Barrow is not just using lawyers anymore. He said Gray Fawn saw them riding in last night, Red Jack's old crew, or what is left of them. Barrow has hired them to, as you said, spook people off their land." The name sent a chill through her. Red Jack's gang was infamous for its ruthlessness. This was a dangerous escalation. The threat was no longer just on paper. It now had a face and a gun. The sun began to set, casting long, cold shadows across the snow. The deputy outside had been relieved by another, a constant, silent reminder of their predicament. Colt was preparing to face the sheriff, and Eliza was cleaning her instruments, her thoughts a turmoil of fear and defiance. The seeds of love that had felt so tentative in the dawn's light now seemed like a reckless folly in the face of such danger. Her small clinic, with its single oil lamp burning against the encroaching night, felt like the most vulnerable place in the world, and yet, as she wiped a scalpel clean, her hand steady and sure, she knew she would not run. This was her home. This was her fight. The fragile truce of the dawn shattered before the morning was out. Magnus Barrow's next assault was not with bullets, but with paper and ink. He had the local Gazette print a special notice, a full page dedicated to the legal resurrection of an old, vaguely worded silver mining claim from territorial days. The document was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, its language a thicket of clauses and codicils that effectively claimed mineral rights to the entire valley. In the cold, clear type, homesteaders were reframed as temporary tenants on Barrow consolidated land, and the Crow were dismissed as nomadic obstructions. The notice was also nailed to the post office wall, a declaration of war disguised as a legal filing. That afternoon, the town council, a body composed of a store owner whose mortgage Barrow held and two ranchers who sold him all their beef, convened an emergency session. They voted unanimously to recognize the legitimacy of Barrow's claim. The law, it seemed, was whatever Magnus Barrow decided to print. The fallout was immediate. A rancher named Silas Croft, whose land bordered the area where Colt had been shot, was brought to Eliza's clinic. His horse had been spooked by a sudden rock slide. He said that sounded suspiciously like a deliberate blast of dynamite. He had been thrown, his leg broken in 2 places. As Eliza worked, expertly setting the bone and fashioning a sturdy splint, she did more than just heal. She took notes. With the cold precision of a scientist, she documented the nature of the break, the man's testimony, the location of the incident. When she was finished, she left Silas resting and walked directly to the sheriff's office. The air inside was stale with the smell of cigar smoke and bureaucracy. Sheriff Reyes looked up from a stack of paperwork, her expression weary. "Dr. Hart, what can I do for you?" Eliza placed her handwritten notes on the desk. "I have just set Silas Croft's leg. He was thrown from his horse near the western ridge. He believes the rock slide that spooked his mount was caused by a deliberate explosion. This is the 3rd accidental injury from that area in the last 2 weeks." She tapped the paper. "I am providing my medical findings as an official witness statement. The injuries are consistent with his account. I want it on the record." Sheriff Reyes read the notes, her lips tightening into a thin line. She looked from the paper to Eliza's determined face. "Eliza, a statement like this, it is going to stir the pot." "The pot is already boiling." "Sheriff," Eliza said, her voice even, "it is about to boil over. All I'm asking is that you document the facts." For a long moment, the sheriff was silent. The pressure from the town council, from Barrow himself, was a physical weight in the room. But Eliza's statement was a fact, a piece of solid ground in a swamp of lies and intimidation, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole town. Sheriff Reyes pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began to write an official report, attaching Eliza's notes to it. It was a small act, but in the suffocating atmosphere of Silver Mercy, it felt like a window had been thrown open. Barrow's response was swift and cunning. The next day, Ezekiel Voss appeared at the clinic, his smile as polished and false as a counterfeit gold coin. He removed his hat, his eyes taking in the humble, clean space. "Dr. Hart," he began, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "Mr. Barrow has taken note of your commendable dedication to this community. He is a great admirer of progress and civic-mindedness." Eliza said nothing, simply wiped down a countertop with a clean cloth, waiting. "He is aware," Voss continued, "that your facilities here are modest. He has authorized me to make you a proposition. Barrow Consolidated is prepared to fund the construction of a new town hospital, a proper building with a surgical theater, recovery beds, the finest equipment from back east. It will be your hospital, to run as you see fit, a beacon of modern medicine on the frontier." The offer hung in the air, glittering and seductive. Eliza thought of the lives she could save, the suffering she could ease with such a facility. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. And in return, she asked, her voice quiet, "A simple gesture of cooperation." Voss said smoothly, "Mr. Barrow feels that certain misunderstandings have arisen regarding his business operations. Your public statement about the Croft accident has been misinterpreted by the more ignorant elements of the population. A retraction, a simple clarification that you are a medical professional, not an expert in mining or ranching disputes, would put the matter to rest. Stick to medicine, doctor, and Mr. Barrow will give you the tools to be the finest physician in the territory." The temptation was a physical ache in her chest, but then she saw Silas Croft's face, the fear and pain in his eyes. She thought of the families living under the shadow of Barrow's paper threats. To accept this offer would be to heal their bodies while helping to destroy their lives. It was a bargain she could not make. "My statement is not a misunderstanding," she said, her voice cold and clear as the winter air. "It is a medical record. It is the truth. Now, unless you have an injury that needs tending, I must ask you to leave." Voss's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "A pity," he said, his voice losing its warmth. "A great pity." He placed his hat back on his head and departed. As soon as he was gone, Eliza found a scrap of wood from the kindling box and a small pot of black paint. In firm, steady letters, she painted a new sign. When it was dry, she nailed it to the wall next to her door for the whole town to see. It read, "No bribes, only bandages." Barrow's next move was to strike at the heart of the resistance. He needed to remove Colt. 2 days later, news ripped through town that the morning stagecoach had been robbed just a few miles south. The strongbox was taken, and the driver, a man new to the route, was shaken but unharmed. By noon, Sheriff Reyes, flanked by 2 deputies, was at the clinic door. "Colt McKinnon," the sheriff said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I am placing you under arrest for armed robbery." Colt, who had been checking the wood supply, stood slowly, his face unreadable. "On what grounds?" "Sheriff, the driver identified you, and this was found dropped near the road." A deputy held up a leather sheath containing a skinning knife with a distinctive handle carved from elk antler. It was identical to the one Colt carried. "That is not mine," Colt said, his voice a low growl. "It is a plant." "I do not doubt it," the sheriff said quietly, her eyes full of regret. "But the evidence is what it is. I have to take you in." As the deputies moved forward, Eliza stepped between them and Colt. "Wait." All eyes turned to her. "Sheriff, before you take him, I insist on performing a full medical examination." The sheriff frowned. "What for? He is not injured." "Is he not?" Eliza countered, her gaze sharp. "He was in a gunshot incident just days ago. A robbery is a violent affair. I need to document his current physical condition for the official record. I need to note any new bruises, cuts, or contusions." or the lack thereof. It is my duty as his physician. It was a brilliant, unexpected move. By creating an official medical record of Colt's state right then, she was making it impossible for anyone to claim he had been injured in the robbery, or for him to be harmed while in custody without it being noticed. The sheriff, a stickler for procedure, saw the legal sense in it. She nodded curtly. 5 minutes, Doctor. Eliza worked quickly, her examination thorough and professional, noting the state of his healing shoulder wound and the absence of any other marks on his body. She made the sheriff sign her notes as a witness. Only then did she step aside and allow them to take Colt away. The arrest tore Silver Mercy in two. The homesteaders and miners who had received Eliza's care gathered in small, angry groups, muttering about injustice. But the more prosperous townspeople, the ones who profited from Barrow's enterprises, shook their heads and spoke loudly in the saloon about how you could never trust a man with a past like McKinnon's. The air grew thick with suspicion and fear, a silence as heavy and ominous as the gray clouds massing over the Absarokas. In the cold, damp quiet of his cell, Colt felt the walls closing in. He had tried to outrun the shadow of Red Jack, but it had a long reach. Now, it had fallen over Eliza. He had seen the look in Voss's eyes, the cold appraisal of a predator. He knew that as long as he was here. She was a target. The thought of leaving, of just vanishing into the wilderness and letting her find a safer life, was a powerful, agonizing pull. It felt like the only way to protect her. Gray Fawn came to see him that evening, a silent presence on the other side of the bars. "They have built a cage of lies for you," the trackers said. "It is a cage I walked into," Colt replied, his voice rough. "I should have kept riding. Now I have brought this down on her." He looked at his friend. "When I get out of this, I am leaving. It is better for her if I am gone." Gray Fawn was silent for a long time, watching Colt with his dark, knowing eyes. "When a wolf is caught in a trap, it can chew off its own leg to be free," he said, his voice quiet as falling snow. "But it is never whole again. Running away is also a kind of wound. It leaves a scar on the soul." The words settled in the cell's cold air, and Colt had no answer. Eliza did not let herself despair. Action was the only antidote. With Colt unjustly jailed, she knew that bandages and sutures were not enough. She needed a new kind of weapon. She went to the small Catholic church and sought out Father Michael, a gentle man with a surprising love for books. In a dusty room behind the altar, he kept a small library of volumes left by a traveling judge years ago. For the next 2 nights, by the light of an oil lamp, the woman of science transformed into a student of the law. She wrestled with the dense, archaic language of territorial statutes and homesteading acts. She found a plat map of the valley in the town records office and brought it back to the church, unrolling it on a large table. As she traced the lines of ownership, she saw the pencil marks, the faint erasures, the subtle alterations that had been made to the official record. She saw one boundary line that had been shifted, a single pencil stroke that cut a widow's pasture in half. It looked like a surgeon's scalpel, cold and precise, cutting a family away from its lifeblood. And then, tucked into the back of a heavy legal tome, she found it, a folded, brittle document tied with a faded ribbon. It was a certified copy of a homestead certificate, filed in the year 1869 by a woman named Sarah Croft, Silas's grandmother. The certificate granted her, and her heirs, clear title to 160 acres of land. Eliza's hands trembled as she located the parcel on the map. It was situated directly over the richest silver deposit in the valley, the very piece of earth that Magnus Barrow coveted most. It was a forgotten piece of paper, a ghost from the past. But it was a legal claim that predated Barrow's by years. It was not a bribe. It was not a bullet. It was a thread of law, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, how to begin sewing it back into place. The discovery of the old homestead certificate felt like holding a single, unlit match in a cavern of darkness. It was not a weapon, not yet, but it was the promise of a flame. First thing in the morning, with the brittle paper carefully folded and protected in an oilcloth pouch. Eliza walked through the deepening snow to the sheriff's office. She did not knock. She walked straight in, her purpose a shield against the cold. Sheriff Alma Reyes was drinking coffee that looked thick enough to tar a roof. She glanced up, her eyes tired but sharp. "More witness statements, Doctor." "Something better," Eliza said, placing the oilcloth pouch on the desk. She carefully unfolded the document, its creases threatening to give way to time. A homestead certificate for the Croft property, dated 1869, filed, certified, and predating Magnus Barrow's resurrected mining claim by 7 years. The sheriff leaned forward, her weariness evaporating. She read the document once, then twice, her finger tracing the faded, elegant script of the territorial clerk. She looked up at Eliza, a new light in her eyes. It was not quite hope, but it was the hard gleam of a fighting chance. "Where did you find this?" "In a law book at the church. It appears to be a certified copy left behind by a traveling circuit judge." "A judge's copy?" Alma mused, a slow smile spreading across her face. "That makes it as good as the original, which I am sure has long since vanished from the official records." She stood up and walked to the wall where a large, detailed map of the valley was pinned. She studied it for a moment, her finger landing on the exact parcel of land, right on top of the mother lode. "This changes things. Eliza, this changes things a great deal." She turned back to the desk. "It does not prove Colt is innocent of robbery, but it gives me enough ammunition to argue that he is being targeted. It is grounds for releasing him on his own recognizance until the circuit judge arrives to hear the case." An hour later, Colt McKinnon walked out of the jailhouse, a free man, at least for now. He stood on the boardwalk, blinking in the flat, gray light of the snow-filled sky. The cold air felt clean and sharp in his lungs after the damp chill of the cell. Eliza was waiting for him, her face partially hidden by the collar of her wool coat. They did not speak. There was no need. He saw in her eyes that she was the reason he was free. The walk back to the clinic was a silent ordeal. Every window seemed to hold watching eyes. Men who had been friendly just a week ago now averted their gazes, turning their backs to shovel snow or check a horse's hoof. The town was divided, and they were standing squarely on the fault line. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the coming storm. Inside the clinic, the warmth from the potbelly stove was a welcome embrace. It felt like a sanctuary, a small island of reason in a sea of hostility. Colt moved to the fire, soaking in the heat, feeling the chill of the jail leach from his bones. "The sheriff told me what you found," he said, his back still to her. "That was a long shot, Doctor." "I am running out of other kinds of shots," she replied, hanging her coat on a peg. "Your shoulder. Let me see it. It is time for the stitches to come out." He turned and slowly unbuttoned his shirt, pulling it carefully over the bandaged wound. She motioned for him to sit, and he obeyed. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the insistent moan of the wind as it whipped around the corners of the building. Snow had begun to fall again, thick, fat flakes that clung to the window panes, further isolating them from the world outside. Eliza worked with her usual focused grace. She gently peeled back the bandage, her brow furrowed in concentration as she inspected the wound. The bullet graze had healed cleanly, the skin puckering slightly around the neat row of black horsehair stitches. It would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of the violence that had brought them together. "It looks good," she said, her voice soft. "No sign of infection. You are a fast healer." She took a small, sharp pair of scissors and a pair of tweezers from a tray. As she leaned in to snip the first stitch, her hair brushed against his cheek. He caught the faint scent of soap and something else, something clean and uniquely her. He held himself perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. "Your hands," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They touch like a feather. Doctor!" She paused, her fingers steady. but a faint blush colored her cheeks. She snipped a stitch and carefully pulled it free with the tweezers. "The bullet only grazed you, Mr. McKinnon, but foolishness runs deep. I would ask you to avoid any more recklessness." She continued her work, her touch impossibly light, her focus absolute. One by one, the stitches came free, releasing the skin from its temporary bonds. When the last one was out, she cleaned the new scar with a soft cloth and a mild antiseptic. The sting was a minor thing, but he was aware of the warmth of her fingers on his skin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She was done, but she did not immediately pull away. Her hand lingered on his shoulder for a fraction of a second too long. In that small, charged space of silence, he moved. He did not think about it. It was an instinct, a need as fundamental as breathing. He reached up and gently took her wrist, stopping her from drawing back. Her skin was soft, the bones beneath delicate yet strong. She froze, her eyes, wide and startled, meeting his. He saw a flicker of fear in them, but also something else, a deep, questioning curiosity. His gaze was steady, his voice low and intensely sincere. All the humor, all the dry wit, was gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished honesty. "You fixed my wound," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. "I want to fix your name." She stared at him, confused. "My name." "Mrs. Mine." The words, so simple, so possessive, so utterly unexpected, landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. A wave of heat rushed through her, from her chest to the tips of her ears. She felt the blood drain from her face, then return with a vengeance. She could not speak, could not move. She could only stare into his gray eyes and see the unwavering truth of his statement. It was not a question. It was a declaration, not a polite proposal from a Boston drawing room, but a raw, elemental claim made here, on the edge of the wilderness, with a storm raging outside. A choked sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped her lips. Tears sprang to her eyes, blurring his face. "Do not," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not say such things when you still might have a fever." He did not release her wrist. I have never been more clear-headed in my life. The intensity of the moment was a living thing, a powerful current flowing between them. It was too much, too fast. She felt as if the solid ground of her well-ordered life had just crumbled away beneath her feet. And then, from the street, a familiar, booming voice cut through the wind. "Hello in there if Mr. McKinnon is planning on changing the good doctor's name. He should know there is a town fee for a new sign." Tommy Pike. His timing was either a disaster or a miracle. The spell was broken. Eliza pulled her hand free, a shaky laugh escaping her as she turned away to hide her crimson face. Colt let out a long breath, a wry smile finally returning to his lips. The moment of levity was instantly annihilated. A deafening crack echoed from the street, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The oil lamp that hung on its iron bracket outside the clinic exploded, plunging the front of the room into sudden, deep shadow. Darkness rushed in to fill the space where the light had been. Colt was on his feet in an instant, moving between Eliza and the door, his body a solid shield. He peered through the snow-caked window. He could just make out two figures on horseback disappearing into the swirling white at the end of the street. It was a warning shot, a message from Barrow. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, the tinkle of falling glass a delicate, terrifying sound. The darkness felt like a physical violation, an invasion of her home. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the lingering warmth of Colt's declaration. They were not safe, not even here. But the fear was quickly consumed by a surge of cold, hard anger. This was her light they had shot out, her beacon. She would not let them extinguish it. She would not let them win with bullets and fear. Without a word, she walked to a supply cabinet. Her hands were steady as she took out a new oil lamp. one she kept in reserve. She filled it with oil from a can, trimmed the wick with a firm, precise snip, and lit it with a match. The flame sputtered, then caught, growing into a bright, steady glow. "They will not drive me out," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of a steel bell. She looked at Colt, her eyes blazing in the new light. "As long as there are people in pain in this town, I will be here." He looked at her, at the fierce, unyielding strength in her small frame, and felt a surge of admiration so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had offered his protection, but he saw now that her own courage was a shield far stronger than any he could provide. That night, as the storm reached its peak, a quiet knock came at the back door of the clinic. Colt answered it, his hand on the butt of his pistol. Sheriff Reyes stood in the swirling snow, a shawl pulled tight around her head. She did not say a word. She simply pressed a cold, heavy object into his hand. It was an iron key, the key to the jailhouse cells. "There is only one deputy on duty tonight," she whispered, her words nearly snatched away by the wind. "He will be at the front desk. Do with that what you will." Then she pressed a small, folded note into Eliza's hand. "Watch your back tonight," it read. Before either of them could respond, she turned and vanished back into the storm. They stood in the doorway, the key cold in Colt's palm. The note a stark warning in Eliza's. The sheriff had chosen her side. The battle lines were no longer invisible. They were drawn clearly in the snow. Eliza closed the door and turned to Colt. She walked to the front window and placed the newly lit lamp on the sill, its warm, golden light pushing back against the raging darkness outside. It was no longer just a light for the lost or the injured. It was a signal, a declaration of defiance, a promise that no matter how hard the wind blew, some flames could not be shot out. By morning, the world had vanished. The blizzard was no longer a storm, but a living entity, a screaming white beast that had swallowed Silver Mercy whole. Snow was piled in monstrous drifts that buried fences, climbed to the eaves of houses, and transformed the single main street into an impassable, undulating landscape of white. The wind drove the snow with the force of sand, scouring paint from wood and finding every crack and crevice to force its way inside. The town was paralyzed, a ship frozen in a sea of ice. The first true crisis came with the dawn. A ranch hand, half frozen and covered in ice, stumbled into town with the news, the weekly supply wagon from Fort Custer, carrying food, mail, and precious medicine, had overturned in a drift 2 miles out. The driver had broken his arm, and the entire town's lifeline was now buried under 6 feet of snow. The news spread not like fire, but like a creeping frost, chilling every heart. Panic was a luxury no one could afford. Action was the only currency that mattered. Before the town council could even think to convene, Sister May was marching through the drifts toward the clinic, her black habit a stark slash against the blinding white. "Eliza," she said, her voice brooking no argument as she burst through the door, bringing a swirl of snow with her. "Your clinic is too small. We are moving everything to the church. It is the only building with a large enough stove and enough room to house those who will need shelter." It was not a suggestion. It was a command born of unshakable faith and practicality. Together, they began the arduous process, Colt moving with a quiet, powerful efficiency. Carried her heavy medical chests through the waist-deep snow. Eliza bundled her precious instruments and jars of medicine, her mind already triaging the patients she knew would come. The church, which hours before had been a place of quiet prayer, was transformed into a field hospital and a sanctuary. The pews were pushed back to make room for pallets and blankets. The great potbelly stove in the center of the room roared to life, a beacon of heat against the storm's fury. Sister May organized the women, directing the rationing of the church's pantry and setting up a makeshift kitchen to serve hot broth and coffee. As Eliza established her medical station near the warmth of the stove, she saw the true face of the town, not the gossips or the collaborators, but the bedrock of decent people. They came with what little they had to spare: a side of bacon, a sack of potatoes, a few extra blankets. The crisis was stripping away the petty divisions, revealing a shared, desperate humanity. But the storm was relentless. Word came that the Jacksons, an elderly couple who lived in a remote cabin up a wooded hollow, were low on medicine for his weak heart. The trail was impassable by wagon, and likely even by a single rider. "I will go," Colt said, his voice a simple statement of fact. He was already pulling on his heavy coat and wrapping a scarf around his face. "It is suicide," one of the ranchers said, shaking his head. "You will not make it through the drifts on the North Trail." "I am not taking the trail," Colt replied. He went to Eliza. "The medicine." She handed him a small, oilcloth-wrapped package. Their eyes met for a second, a silent exchange of fear and trust. She watched him walk out into the white fury of the storm, leading his horse, a powerful roan that was as tough and resilient as its owner. He was not just a man with a past anymore. He was a lifeline. The day wore on in a blur of activity. Eliza treated frostbite, tended to a nasty burn a woman received from a faulty stovepipe, and calmed the fevers of children huddled in the warmth of the church. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and wet wool. Late in the afternoon, a new terror erupted. A woman, her face a mask of frantic fear, burst into the church, her screams cutting through the howl of the wind. "My boy, it is my Leo. He is gone." It was Martha Gable, a widow who had a small homestead on the edge of town. Her 10-year-old son, sent to check the woodpile not 50 yards from their door, had vanished into the disorienting whiteout. Instantly, a search party was formed. Men pulled on their coats and grabbed lanterns, though the light would be useless in the swirling snow. Colt had just returned, covered in ice but successful in his delivery to the Jacksons. Without a moment's rest, he joined the search. He understood the treacherous nature of this landscape better than anyone. He knew how a familiar path could become a death trap, how a simple dip in the ground could be a hidden, snow-filled ravine. He found the boys' tracks near the creek bed, already fading. He followed them with a hunter's instinct, his eyes scanning the unnatural contours of the snow. He stopped at the edge of what looked like a small gully, now filled to the brim with soft, deep powder. And there, at the bottom of a faint depression, he saw the red wool of a child's mitten. Leo had fallen into a deep crevasse, hidden by the fresh snowfall. He was alive, but trapped, the snow up to his chest and his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The rescue was a testament to calm competence in the face of chaos. Colt directed the other men, his voice a steady command against the storm's roar. They tied a series of lariats together, a symbol of their shared purpose. With the rope tied securely around his own chest, Colt lowered himself into the crevasse. He spoke to the terrified boy in a low, calming voice, promising him warmth and his mother's care. He worked a second rope around the boy, and with the combined strength of the men above, they were both hauled, inch by painful inch, from the snowy maw. When Colt carried the shivering, crying boy into the church and placed him in his mother's arms, a hush fell over the room. The people of Silver Mercy, who had whispered about him, who had judged him for a past they could only imagine, now saw him for what he was: a man who would walk into a blizzard to deliver medicine to the old and risk his own life to save a child. The rope that had pulled Leo from the ravine had also begun to pull the community back together. But as the town fought for its survival, Magnus Barrow was fighting a different kind of war. Under the cover of the storm, he had made his move. That night, as the blizzard began to show the first signs of abating, Gray Fawn appeared at the church, silent as a shadow. He drew Colt aside, his face grim. "He is using the storm," the tracker said, his voice barely a whisper. "He brought in a steam drill, on skids, pulled by a team of 20 mules. They have it on the croftland now, getting ready to test the ground." A cold rage, harder and more dangerous than the storm. settled in Colt's gut. While the townspeople were sharing their last crusts of bread, Barrow was moving in for the kill. "He cannot be allowed to do that," Colt said. "They have guards," Grey Fawn warned. "The men you know. Red Jack's crew." That did not matter. An unspoken agreement passed between the two men. They slipped out of the church, armed with heavy wrenches and a shared sense of purpose. The world was a strange, moonless landscape of snowdrifts and shadows. They moved with a stealth born of long years in the wilderness, the sound of their movements swallowed by the dying wind. They found the drilling machine, a monstrous black skeleton of iron against the snow. It was a desecration of the quiet valley. As Grey Fawn kept watch, Colt went to work, his powerful hands loosening critical bolts and disabling the steam valve. But they had underestimated their enemy's vigilance. A guard, seeing a flicker of movement, shouted an alarm. The night exploded into chaos. Gunshots flashed in the darkness, the bullets whining harmlessly into the snowbanks. It was not a fight. It was a confused, desperate scramble. As Colt and Grey Fawn retreated, one of Red Jack's men lunged out of the darkness, swinging a rifle like a club. Colt sidestepped, but his foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. He went down hard, his arm twisting beneath him as he crashed against a jagged outcropping of rock hidden by the drifts. A sharp, searing pain shot from his wrist to his shoulder. Grey Fawn fired his own rifle into the air, creating a diversion, and in the ensuing confusion, they melted back into the shadows and the snow. They made it back to the church just before dawn. Eliza took one look at Colt's face, pale with pain, and the way he was cradling his arm, and she went into action. Her makeshift clinic was now dealing with a triple crisis. In one corner, she had Leo, his broken leg now expertly splinted, his feverish sleep watched over by his grateful mother. In the center of the room were a dozen people suffering from exposure and frostbite, their needs constant and demanding. And now, she had Colt, his wrist clearly broken, his face etched with a new layer of exhaustion and pain. While Sister May and the other women tended to the townsfolk, Eliza led Colt to a quiet corner. She worked under the flickering lantern light, her fingers gentle but sure as she examined the injury. "It is a clean break," she said, her voice a low murmur meant only for him. The rock did a better job than the bullet. While she prepared a splint and bandages, a part of her mind was already at work, composing another medical statement. Patient presented with a Collis's fracture of the right wrist, consistent with a hard fall. Multiple contusions on the shoulder and ribs. No new gunshot wounds. Every injury, every act of violence would be recorded. She was not just a healer. She was becoming the town's memory, its conscience, its most reliable witness. But Barrow's allies were fighting their own war of whispers. The sight of Colt and the doctor, constantly in each other's company, their lives now so clearly intertwined, had not gone unnoticed. Martha Gable's gratitude for her son's rescue was a powerful force, but the opposing current of gossip was just as strong. As Eliza was wrapping Colt's wrist, she heard a woman, one of the town councilman's wives, speaking in a stage whisper that was meant to be overheard. "It is hardly proper, an unmarried woman and a man like that, living under the same roof, even if it is the roof of a church." Eliza finished tying the bandage. Then she stood up, her small frame radiating an authority that silenced the room. She turned and faced the whispering woman, her eyes clear and direct. "For the past 2 days," Eliza said, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the church, "we have been cold and we have been hungry. We have been afraid. In that time, I have seen this community share its last supplies. I have seen men risk their lives in the snow to search for a lost child. I have seen Mr. McKinnon here, a man you are so quick to judge, rescue that child and bring him back to his mother." She gestured to the people huddled together. "We have chosen to face this storm with kindness. If you wish to give that a different name, a meaner name, that is your choice, but it will not change the truth of what we have done here together. A profound silence followed her words. The councilman's wife flushed a deep red and looked away. In that moment, the rumors died, starved of the oxygen of belief. As if summoned by her display of moral authority, Sheriff Alma Reyes entered the church. She surveyed the scene, her eyes lingering on Colt's newly splinted wrist. Then she walked to the center of the room and made her own announcement. "Due to the ongoing state of emergency," she said, her voice ringing with official power, "and in the interest of public safety, I am ordering the temporary confiscation of all firearms belonging to non-residents currently employed by the Barrow Consolidated Mining Company. Any armed group presents a potential hazard to the public welfare during a natural disaster." It was a brilliant legal maneuver. She was not accusing them of a crime. She was using the storm itself as her justification to disarm Red Jack's gang. It was a checkmate, and everyone in the room knew it. Later that day, as the first rays of sun finally broke through the clouds, a new sign appeared, nailed to the door of the clinic, which was still closed. It was a piece of planking, with letters cheerfully, if crudely, painted on it. Tommy Pike's handiwork was unmistakable. It read, "Open during blizzards. Closed when we run out of hurt people." A small crowd had gathered to read it, and for the first time in days, the sound of laughter echoed in the clean, cold air of Silver Mercy. The thaw that followed the blizzard was not just a melting of snow, but a cracking of the ice of fear that had held Silver Mercy in its grip. With the roads finally clear enough for a horse-drawn sleigh, Territorial Circuit Judge Harrison Keene arrived. He was a man whose face seemed carved from granite, all hard lines and deep-set, intelligent eyes that had seen every form of human folly the frontier could offer. He was not a man to be swayed by money or influence. His only allegiance was to the letter of the law. There was no courthouse in Silver Mercy. The largest, most neutral space available was the town's main warehouse, a cavernous, drafty building that smelled of grain dust and cold iron. Benches were hauled in from the church and the saloon, creating a makeshift gallery. A large shipping crate was draped with a bolt of purple cloth to serve as the judge's bench. Magnus Barrow arrived with Ezekiel Voss at his side, both men exuding an unshakable confidence, as if the proceedings were a mere formality. On the other side of the aisle sat Eliza, Colt, and Sheriff Reyes, a small, determined trio against a tide of power. The rest of the town filled the benches, their faces a mixture of hope, fear, and morbid curiosity. The proceedings began with a grim efficiency. Judge Keene's voice was a low baritone that cut through the chilly air. He first heard the robbery charge against Colt McKinnon, the stagecoach driver. A nervous young man, clearly intimidated by the proceedings, gave a shaky testimony. His identification of Colt flimsy at best under the sheriff's pointed questioning about the poor light and the robber's covered face. Then, the focus shifted to the larger, more complex issue of Magnus Barrow's land claims. This was Eliza's battle. When her name was called, she walked to the stand, her back straight, her medical casebook held firmly in her hands. She was not a lawyer, but she had a weapon more powerful than any legal argument: the truth, recorded in meticulous detail. She spoke with the calm, dispassionate clarity of a physician describing a disease. She presented her signed and witnessed medical report on Colt's initial bullet graze, the entry point and the trajectory of the projectile. She stated, her voice clear and steady, indicate it was fired from an elevated position consistent with the ridge where Mr. Barrow's men were stationed, not from the level ground of a cattle trail. Next, she described Silas Croft's broken leg. The multiple spiral fractures are the result of a significant torsional force, such as being thrown from a violently bucking horse. It is not an injury one would expect from a simple stumble. Finally, she presented her notes on Colt's broken wrist, a classic Colles fracture, caused by a fall onto an outstretched hand, exactly as one would expect from slipping on ice while running from an aggressor in the dark. She did not speculate. She did not accuse. She simply laid out a sequence of physical facts, a litany of violence that painted a damning picture. Grayfawn was next, in a few carefully chosen words. He described the tracks of the 20-mule team and the heavy steam drill, mapping their route under the cover of the storm, a route that led directly onto the land claimed by the Croft family. He produced a sketch map drawn on a piece of hide, his lines as precise and certain as his testimony. Finally, Sheriff Reyes took the stand. She presented the imitation knife sheath, noting that Colt's own knife had never left his belt. She described how she had confiscated the weapons from Barrow's hired men, an action that had likely prevented further violence during the blizzard. The evidence was piling up, a wall of fact against which Barrow's claims seemed increasingly hollow. Then it was Ezekiel Voss's turn. He rose to his feet, a confident, predatory smile on his face. He did not try to refute the evidence. He attacked the witness. "Dr. Hart," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you are a newcomer to our territory. Are you not a young woman, all alone, fresh from the civilized environs of Boston?" He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Tell me, in your esteemed medical training, did they teach you about the particular loneliness of the frontier, about how a woman of certain sensibilities might find herself impressionable?" Eliza stiffened. "My medical training is not on trial here." "Oh, but I believe it is," Voss purred. "Your entire testimony rests on your professional objectivity, and yet you have taken a personal, and may I say, highly unusual interest in the affairs of the defendant. Mr. McKinnon, you harbored him in your clinic against a direct request from a law officer. You have attended to his every need. The town has a rather colorful nickname for you, does it not? The Virgin Doctor." He spat the words out, twisting the town's rough affection into a vile insult. A wave of murmurs and whispers swept through the gallery. Voss pressed his advantage. "Is it not possible, Doctor, that your judgment has been clouded by a romantic attachment, that you see conspiracies and acts of aggression where there are only the normal, unfortunate accidents of frontier life? Is it not possible that you are not an objective witness at all, but a woman trying to protect her patient?" He loaded the last word with a world of insinuation. Eliza felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of humiliation and anger. She opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, a voice cut through the room, low and dangerous. "I see a doctor." Every head turned. Colt McKinnon was on his feet. His hands were not clenched into fists, but his stance was one of absolute, unshakable solidarity. He looked directly at Voss, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire. "I do not see a joke." The room fell silent, the impact of his words as powerful as a physical blow. Judge Keene banged his gavel once, a sharp crack in the stillness. "The witness will refrain from personal commentary, and the defendant will be seated." Colt sat, but the point had been made. The tide of opinion in the room had shifted, a subtle but palpable change. The legal battle turned to the documents. Eliza's certified copy of the 1869 homestead certificate was presented as evidence. It was their trump card, their proof of a prior claim. Voss examined it with a theatrical flourish, holding it up to the light from the warehouse's high, dirty windows. "A fascinating piece of history, Your Honor," he said with a smirk, "and a complete and utter forgery." A collective gasp went through the room. "The seal of the territorial clerk's office," Voss announced, pointing with a manicured finger, "is a crude imitation. The genuine seal from that period has a small flaw in the eagle's left wing. This one is perfect, too perfect. This document is worthless." Eliza's heart plummeted. She felt Colt tense beside her. It was a devastating, unforeseen blow. All their hope, all their effort, was based on a fake. Voss was not finished. He unrolled a large, official-looking plat map on a table. "This, Your Honor, is the official survey map from the county records office, updated just last year. As you can see, the parcel in question is clearly marked as unclaimed territorial land, open for mineral exploration. Mr. Barrow's claim is perfectly legal and proper." He pointed to the bottom of the map. to the official signature and seal, signed by the county clerk himself, Mr. Abernathy. Eliza stared at the map, at the neat, precise lines that signed away a family's heritage. And then she saw it. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She remembered the faint pencil marks on the map she had studied in the church, the almost invisible traces of erasure, and she remembered the signature on the forged certificate. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "May I see that map more closely?" The judge nodded. Eliza approached the table, her heart pounding. She looked at the signature of the clerk, and then she looked at Sheriff Reyes. The same thought occurred to them at the exact same moment. "That is his signature," the sheriff said, her voice grim. "But County Clerk Abernathy took a sudden leave of absence a year ago. A family emergency back east, he said. No one has seen or heard from him since." The implication hung in the air, cold and heavy. Barrow had not just found a loophole. He had rewritten the law itself. He had altered the official records and then made sure the only man who could testify to the forgery had vanished. The room was a tinderbox of confusion and anger. The legal case had dissolved into a hall of mirrors, with forgeries reflecting forgeries. Judge Keene's face was a mask of cold fury. He looked from the worthless certificate to the suspect map, a man of law trapped in a web of lies. It was then that Eliza found her voice again. Not the voice of a medical expert, but the voice of a citizen of Silver Mercy. She turned from the table and faced the judge. But her words were for everyone in that warehouse. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a passion that silenced every whisper. "I came to this territory to mend broken bones and heal fevers. I work with a scalpel, and my scalpel does not distinguish between a rich man and a poor one. It cuts to find the truth of a wound. Why should the law do any less?" The room was utterly, profoundly silent, in that moment of pure, unassailable truth. A new sound began to filter in from outside. It started as a low murmur, then grew into a chant. Outside the warehouse, the remaining members of Red Jack's crew, disarmed but still arrogant, had decided to intimidate the waiting townspeople. They swaggered and sneered, trying to provoke a fight. But the people of Silver Mercy were no longer afraid. They linked arms, forming a human chain in front of the warehouse doors. And at the front of that chain, standing defiant, his splinted leg a badge of honor, was 10-year-old Leo Gable. "Let the law speak," he shouted, his child's voice high and clear. The chant was taken up by the others, growing in volume and power. "Let the law speak, let the law speak." It was the voice of a community that had found its courage, a shield of solidarity against the bullies and the thugs. Inside, Judge Keene listened to the chant from the street, and he looked at the irrefutable evidence of corruption before him. He picked up his gavel, but instead of banging it, he picked up a heavy ink stamp. "This court is faced with a mockery of due process," he boomed, his voice filled with righteous anger. "We have fraudulent documents, a missing public official, and clear evidence of witness intimidation." He brought the stamp down hard on a fresh sheet of paper, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a hammer blow against the anvil of greed. "Therefore," he declared, "I am issuing a temporary injunction. All mining and land acquisition activities of the Barrow Consolidated Company in this valley are hereby frozen. I am ordering a full and independent investigation by the United States Marshals into the disappearance of County Clerk Abernathy and the fraudulent alteration of these public records. This hearing is adjourned until such a time as the truth can be properly and legally determined." It was not a final victory, but it was a reprieve. The balance of power in Silver Mercy had been broken, and the pieces were now scattered for all to see. For the first time, a shadow of doubt had fallen across the confident face of Magnus Barrow, and in the cold, dusty air of the warehouse, a new and fragile hope was born. The town's victory celebration was a fragile, short-lived thing. It was a single candle lit in a hurricane, and the hurricane's name was Magnus Barrow. He did not wait for the ink on the judge's injunction to dry. That same night, revenge came. not with the force of a storm, but with the quiet, insidious creep of fire. A red glow against the low-hanging clouds was the first sign. Then came the smell, sharp and acrid, of burning grain and seasoned timber. Shouts echoed through the cold. Muddy streets as the volunteer fire bell began its frantic, desperate clang. The whole town poured from their homes and the saloon, their faces illuminated by a terrible, dancing light. Sister May's granary, the storehouse that held the town's collective hope for surviving the rest of the long winter, was a roaring inferno. They were helpless against it. The fire was too hot, too fast. The men formed a bucket brigade from the town well, a futile gesture against the rage of the blaze. But they had to do something. They had to fight, even in a losing battle. Eliza stood with Sister May, watching the structure that had been their sanctuary during the blizzard sag and collapse into a geyser of sparks and embers. The heat was a physical blow, forcing them back. When the roof finally fell in, sending a column of fire straight to the heavens, the fight was over. All that was left was to watch it burn to the ground, in the terrible, flickering light. Sheriff Reyes and Colt moved around the perimeter of the blaze. They did not have to look far. In a patch of melting snow shielded from the worst of the heat, the tracks were clear, heavy boot prints, the same kind worn by the rough men in Red Jack's crew, leading away from the back of the granary and disappearing in the direction of Barrow's mining camp. Magnus Barrow, when questioned by the sheriff the next morning, simply smiled. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice smooth with false sympathy. "Sparks from a stovepipe. I imagine these old wooden buildings are such a hazard." He washed his hands of the affair, a king denying the actions of his knights. The townspeople gathered the next morning in the smoldering, blackened ruins. The air was thick with the heartbreaking smell of charred wood and roasted grain. All that remained were blackened timbers and a deep layer of useless, smoking ash. It was a scene of utter desolation. Eliza stood beside Sister May, looking at the ruin. The older woman's face was a mask of grief, but her eyes were dry. It was Eliza who began to cry. Her tears were not for the lost food or the destroyed building. She wept for the hope that had been turned to ash. She saw the faces of the hungry children, the desperation in the eyes of the homesteaders, and she wept because their outstretched hands, which had been so close to being filled, were now empty once more. That night, the clinic was a haven of quiet in a town sunk in despair. The cold had returned with a vengeance, seeping through the walls, a physical manifestation of the town's mood. Eliza was cleaning her instruments, her movements slow and weary. Colt sat by the stove, his splinted wrist resting on his knee, watching her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. "We could leave," he said, his voice so low she almost did not hear him. She stopped her work and turned to look at him. "There is nothing for us here but this fight," he continued, his eyes fixed on the firelight. "It will not end. Barrow will not stop until he has won or we are in the ground. We could go to Wyoming. I know the territory. We could find a place, start over, a place where no one is trying to burn our world down." The offer was a lifeline, a vision of peace so seductive it made her ache. A life without fear, without the constant weight of an entire community on her shoulders. A life with him. She looked at his strong, quiet profile, at the man who had faced down her enemies and stood by her side without question. The thought of it was a sweet, sharp pang of longing. Then she looked out the window, through the condensation her breath had made on the cold glass. She could see the faint lamplight in the gable house, where a young boy was recovering from a broken leg. She thought of Silas Croft and the Jackson couple, and all the other families huddled in their cabins, their pantries nearly empty, their future a terrifying unknown. "Look out there. Colt," she said, her voice a near whisper. "They need us. Their children are hungry. Their hope is gone. Running away does not fix that. It just leaves them to face the darkness alone." He was silent for a long time. He turned from the fire and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not just the woman he wanted to protect, but the doctor who would not abandon her post. He saw a courage that was deeper and quieter than his own. A strength that came not from a fast gun or strong fists, but from a resolute heart. He finally understood what Grey Fawn had tried to tell him in that cold jail cell. To run would be to cut out a piece of his own soul. Protecting her did not mean spiriting her away to safety. It meant building a fortress right here, beside her. "You are right," he said, and the words were a vow. "Staying. That is the only answer." He stood up, his movements filled with a new, settled purpose. "I am going to see the sheriff. If Barrow wants to fight with fire and shadows, then we will have a watch. The men who stood outside the warehouse will stand guard. We will not be caught by surprise again." He left, and Eliza watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and a terrifying, bone-deep fear for what was to come. But the town, it turned out, was not dead. It was merely wounded. The fire that was meant to break their spirit had instead cauterized it, burning away the last vestiges of fear and apathy. The next day, Silas Croft, leaning on a pair of crude crutches, brought a small but heavy burlap sack to the church. It was his seed grain for the spring planting. "It is not much," he said to Sister May, "but it is a start." His act of faith broke the dam of despair. Another farmer brought a sack of potatoes. A woman offered a side of cured pork she had been saving. Grey Fawn, who had watched the fire with a cold, silent rage, appeared with 2 snowshoe hares he had trapped, and he began quietly showing the younger homesteaders how to build their own snares along the creek bed. Then came Tommy Pike. He had been gone since the trial, having taken the judge on the first leg of his journey out of the valley. He returned with his stagecoach, not empty, but laden with sacks of flour, beans, and salted fish. He had used his own credit and every ounce of his considerable charm to convince the quartermaster at Fort Custer to advance the town some emergency supplies. He pulled up in front of the church with a flourish, a broad grin on his face. Nailed to the side of his stagecoach was a new, hand-painted sign. It read, "The Silver Mercy Supply Express, sponsored by good people and bad luck, but we will be okay." The sight of that ridiculous, defiant sign was the final spark. A cheer went up, thin and ragged at first, then growing in strength. It was the sound of a town refusing to die. That night, as the town organized its first volunteer watch, Eliza sat alone in her clinic. The immediate crisis had passed, replaced by the slow, grinding work of survival and rebuilding. In the quiet, she finally had a moment to confront the turmoil within herself. Colt's words, "Mrs." Mine still echoed in her thoughts. They were words that should have thrilled her, and a part of her, a deep, lonely part, was thrilled. But another part was terrified. She looked at her hands, the hands that knew the landscape of the human body, that could set a bone and stitch a wound. She looked at her medical books, her jars of herbs, her polished instruments. This was her identity. This was who she was. Dr. Hart. She realized with a sudden, painful clarity that her fear of marriage had never truly been about the physical intimacy she had never known. It was not about the town's gossip or the virgin doctor label. It was a fear of being erased. In her world, a wife was an extension of her husband, Mrs. Colt McKinnon. Would there be room in that name for Dr. Eliza Hart? She was afraid of losing the one thing she had fought so hard to win, the freedom to be herself, to practice her craft, to answer to no one but her own conscience and her oath. She loved Colt. The realization was as certain and as terrifying as the sunrise. But she did not know if she could love him and still be herself. She knew then that she had to speak to him, to lay bare this one last fear. Their fight for the valley was a fight for justice and land, but for her, there was now another battle to be fought, a quiet, internal struggle for the territory of her own soul. The volunteer night watch brought a new rhythm to Silver Mercy. Men took turns patrolling the muddy street in pairs, their lanterns casting long, shifting shadows. It was a fragile shield, but it was a shield they had built themselves. The fear that had once been a suffocating fog was now a whetstone, sharpening their resolve. Inside the clinic, a different kind of watch was being kept. The long days of tending to the town's needs and the tense nights of listening for trouble had created a quiet, domestic intimacy between Eliza and Colt. They fell into an easy partnership, sharing meals cooked on the potbelly stove, drinking coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, and working side by side to bring order to the chaos. But beneath the surface of this comfortable routine, Eliza's unspoken fear was a constant, low hum of anxiety. She chose her moment one evening after they had finished a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The town was quiet. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant, reassuring tread of the watchman's boots in the snow. Colt was cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. Eliza sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Colt," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped his work and looked at her, his full attention a tangible force in the small room. "We need to talk about what you said during the storm." He set the rifle aside and nodded slowly. "I remember what I said." "Mrs. Mine," she repeated the words, testing their weight on her tongue. It is a beautiful thing to say, and a terrifying one. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. "I have spent my entire life fighting to be Dr. Hart. I fought my family, my professors, the entire world, it seemed, for the right to be who I am, to have this skill in my hands." She held them up, the surgeon's hands, capable and clean. "If I were to become Mrs. Mine, as you say it, I need to know that mine does not mean I stop being me. I need it to mean that I am still allowed to be myself." The silence that followed was profound. She had laid her soul bare, offering him the most vulnerable part of herself. She saw a flicker of understanding, then a deep, thoughtful seriousness settle in his eyes. He did not dismiss her fear. He honored it. He rose from his chair and came to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm and firm, a solid anchor in her sea of doubt. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, earnest rumble. "When I look at you, I do not see a woman I want to own. I see a woman I want to stand beside. You are Dr. Hart. That is who you are. It is the steel in you. I would never try to bend that. I would never want to—" He paused, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands. "So if mine is not the right word, then we are ours." Ours, the word was a revelation. It was not about possession, it was about partnership. A shared territory, not a conquered one. A wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical release washed over her. The fear she had harbored for so long, the fear of being diminished, simply dissolved in the warmth of his understanding. The next afternoon, he came to her with something in his hand. He was hesitant, a rare uncertainty in his movements. "I have something for you," he said, his voice a little rough. "It is not much." He opened his palm. Lying there was a simple, unadorned ring. It was not gold or silver. It was made of a dark, matte gray metal, forged into a simple band. It was imperfect, showing the faint marks of a hammer, but it was solid and strong. "What is it?" she whispered, mesmerized by its stark beauty. "It is a railroad spike," he said. "I found it discarded by the new tracks. I took it to Gunner, the blacksmith. He forged it for me." He looked from the ring to her eyes. "Barrow's railroad is a weapon. He uses it to break, to drive people apart. I wanted to take a piece of his weapon and make it into something else, something that connects, something that holds." He took a breath. "I am not a man for fancy words, Eliza, but I know what is true. I want to build a life with you, right here, in this town that we are fighting for." It was the most honest, heartfelt proposal she could ever have imagined. It was not adorned with wealth or poetry, but with a meaning so profound it took her breath away. This ring was not a symbol of ownership, but a testament to their shared struggle, a promise to turn the instruments of oppression into the foundations of a future. She held out her hand, and he slid the cool, heavy ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Their agreement was sealed not with a dramatic kiss, but with a quiet, solemn understanding that was far more powerful. They laid out the terms of their new partnership, their own homestead act for the territory of their future. She would always be Dr. Hart. Her oath to heal, to serve the community, would never be compromised. He, in turn, would not bring the violence of his past or the town's defense into their home. He would stand with the sheriff, an ally of the law, not a vigilante outside of it. Their strengths would complement each other, a surgeon's scalpel and a protector's rifle, both in service of the same cause. The town, with its uncanny ability to sense the subtle shifts in the human heart, seemed to understand. Sister May saw them standing together outside the clinic one afternoon, the dark ring a starkly visible band on Eliza's hand. She smiled, a deep, knowing smile. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "it seems there is one thing Magnus Barrow's railroad has managed to deliver that is actually worth something." Meanwhile, within Barrow's own camp, the foundations were beginning to crack. Ezekiel Voss was a creature of opportunity, and he could feel the prevailing winds beginning to shift. The judge's injunction, the town's unified defiance, and the quiet, unyielding strength of the doctor and the gunman had changed the equation. Voss began to quietly duplicate certain documents from Barrow's files ledgers, letters, shipping manifests. He kept them hidden, a secret insurance policy against the day his powerful employer might fall, taking everyone else down with him. The true earthquake, however, came from the wilderness. It was Gray Fawn who brought the news. He appeared at the clinic late one night, his face impassive but his eyes burning with an urgent light. With him was a small, thin man with a nervous tic and eyes that darted around as if expecting an attack at any moment. He was wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe. "Dr. Hart," Gray Fawn said, "this is Mr. Abernathy." It was the missing county clerk. Eliza stared at him, dumbfounded. He looked 10 years older than the last time she had seen him, his hair now streaked with gray, his face a roadmap of fear. "They tried to kill me," Abernathy whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. He had been hiding for the better part of a year in a remote crow hunting camp, protected by Gray Fawn's people after Barrow's men had run him off the road and left him for dead. Barrow and Voss. They made me change the maps. They made me sign the new pages for the ledger. He reached into a leather satchel he was clutching as if it were his own heart. "But they did not get everything," he said, his hand trembling as he pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. "When they forced me to replace the pages, I managed to keep the originals. This is the real county plat book, from before Barrow altered it." He opened it on Eliza's examination table. There, in the neat, faded ink of a year ago, was the truth. The Croft homestead was clearly marked. The other small ranches were all in their rightful places. It was irrefutable, official proof of Barrow's crime. A message was dispatched to Judge Keene by telegraph that very night. A new hearing was set. The final battle was at hand. While the town buzzed with the news, Eliza began her own preparations. She gathered every medical note she had taken since arriving in Silver Mercy. The bullet graze, the broken bones, the frostbite from the storm, the burns from the fire. She compiled them all into a single, comprehensive file. It was more than a collection of medical records. It was the case history of a town under siege. It was the complete diagnosis of the disease called Magnus Barrow. The day before the new hearing, Tommy Pike saw Colt loading firewood into the back of the clinic. He leaned against the side of his stagecoach, a grin on his face. "That is a fine ring she is wearing. McKinnon," he said, gesturing with his thumb, "did not figure you for the marrying kind, and definitely not for the expensive jewelry kind." Colt paused, hefting another log onto his shoulder. He looked at Tommy, a rare, small smile on his face. "I treat my poverty with hard work. Tommy," he said, "not with shiny things." He finished loading the wood and went inside. leaving Tommy chuckling in the cold afternoon air. The fight was not over, but inside the clinic, the fire was laid, the home was warm, and they were ready. The reconvened hearing was an entirely different affair. The drafty warehouse was no longer just a makeshift courtroom. It was the stage for the final act of a long and bitter play. The benches were packed, the air electric with anticipation. This time, there was no fear on the faces of the townspeople, only a hard, watchful resolve. Judge Harrison Keene sat upon his makeshift bench like a carved monument to the law, his face grim and unreadable. The proceedings began with the star witness. When Clerk Abernathy was called to the stand, a hush fell over the room. He was a ghost returned from the grave, and his presence alone was a damning indictment. He walked to the witness stand with a shuffling, hesitant gait, clutching the heavy, original plat book to his chest as if it were a holy text. Ezekiel Voss, his usual smirk replaced by a tight, strained line, began the cross-examination. But his attacks were feeble. He tried to paint Abernathy as a disgruntled, fired employee, an unreliable drunkard who had fled his post. But Abernathy, though visibly terrified, held firm. "He put a gun to my head," Abernathy said, his voice trembling but clear, pointing a shaky finger at Magnus Barrow. "He and his men, they told me they would bury my family in an unmarked grave if I did not sign the new ledger pages. They gave me a horse and a bag of coins and told me to ride east and never look back." "A fantastic story," Voss boomed. "Trying to regain control, a fiction concocted by this town to steal Mr. Barrow's rightful property." "Then explain this, Mr. Voss," Judge Keene interrupted, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. He gestured to the heavy ledger Abernathy had brought with him. "Explain the county's own seal. Explain the clerk's signature on pages that he himself testifies are fraudulent. Explain the original pages, which he has preserved." The original ledger lay open on a table for all to see, its faded ink and honest lines a stark contrast to the crisp, false map Voss had presented before. The forgery was undeniable. Barrow's empire of paper was built on a foundation of lies, and that foundation was now crumbling. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. The United States Marshal, who had arrived with the judge, called his first witnesses in the federal investigation 2 members of Red Jack's crew. They had been offered a deal full confessions in exchange for a recommendation of leniency, and they took it without a second thought. Their loyalty to Barrow was only as deep as his pockets, and they saw no profit in following him to a federal prison. One by one, they took the stand and laid the conspiracy bare. They confessed to the staged robbery of the stagecoach, to the intimidation of the homesteaders, to the deliberate act of arson that had destroyed Sister May's granary. They testified that every action had been taken on the direct orders, and with the direct payment of Magnus Barrow. With each confession, another stone was pulled from the wall of Barrow's power. He sat at his table, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into a rictus of pure, cornered rage. His empire was gone, his money was useless, his name was mud. He was ruined. The entire hearing had taken less than 2 hours. Judge Keene looked down from his bench, his eyes filled with a cold, righteous fury. "Magnus Barrow," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous warehouse. "Stand and face this court." Barrow rose slowly to his feet. He looked not at the judge, but at the faces of the townspeople at Silas Croft, at Martha Gable, at Sister May. And then he looked at Eliza and Colt, in their quiet, unyielding strength. He saw the architects of his downfall. In that moment, the veneer of the civilized businessman, the captain of industry, cracked and fell away, revealing the raw, violent predator beneath. His eyes darted to the deputy standing near the door, to the holstered pistol on the man's hip. It happened in a heartbeat, with a guttural roar. Barrow lunged, shoving the deputy off balance and ripping the revolver from its holster. He was a blur of desperate motion, swinging the gun around, trying to blast a path to freedom. Time seemed to slow down. Eliza saw the barrel of the gun swing toward her, There was no time to think, no time to scream. But Colt moved faster than thought. He threw himself in front of her, his body a solid, living shield, accepting the path of the bullet without hesitation. But the shot never came. A single deafening crack echoed through the warehouse, sharper and cleaner than the thunder of Barrow's stolen weapon. The revolver flew from Barrow's hand, clattering across the wooden floor as if struck by an invisible fist. He cried out, clutching his hand, which was now a mangled, bleeding ruin. Across the room, Sheriff Alma Reyes stood in a cloud of gun smoke, her own pistol held steady in a two-handed grip. Her face was calm, her aim true. She had not shot to kill. She had shot to disarm, a feat of breathtaking skill and control that had saved every life in that room. It was the final, decisive act of a lawwoman choosing order over chaos, justice over vengeance. Deputies swarmed over Barrow, pinning him to the floor. The crisis was over as quickly as it had begun. Judge Keene's gavel came down with the finality of a guillotine. The verdict was swift and absolute. Magnus Barrow was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, arson, and a dozen other charges. His mining permits were permanently revoked. The fraudulent land claims were nullified, and the court ordered the full and immediate restoration of all lands to their rightful owners as detailed in the original county ledger. Barrow himself was sentenced to the maximum term in the federal penitentiary. As the marshals hauled the screaming, defeated man away, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. It was the quiet that follows a great storm. Eliza found she was trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming relief of survival. Colt's arm was still protectively around her, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. Before adjourning, Judge Keene looked to Eliza. "Dr. Hart," he said, his stern face softening for the first time. "Does the community have a final statement?" Eliza stepped forward. She looked not at the judge, but at the assembled faces of her town, her neighbors, her friends. "A community is like a body," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It suffers wounds, but a healthy community is one where those wounds are cleaned and faced directly, not covered up with the false bandage of money." A murmur of assent went through the crowd. Then, someone at the back shouted a single word, "Mercy." Another voice picked it up, and then another, "Soon." The entire warehouse was filled with the sound, a swelling, cathartic chant of their own name, a name that was no longer just a place on a map, but a testament to what they had endured and overcome. Mercy, mercy, mercy. They were no longer a collection of divided, fearful individuals. They were a community, forged in fire and bound by a shared victory. In that moment, watching the faces of her neighbors, Eliza felt the last of her old fears fall away. This was her home. This was her life. Her love for the man standing beside her was not a cage, but a foundation upon which to build. And Colt, looking at the town that had nearly cast him out, felt the restless spirit that had driven him for so long finally come to a quiet rest. He was no longer running from his past. He was planting his future. The judge brought his gavel down a final time, but it was the red ink of the clerk's stamp on the confiscation order that truly marked the end. It was a bright, crimson seal on the final page of a dark and bloody chapter in the history of Silver Mercy. As the crowd began to file out into the clean, cold sunlight, their face bright with hope, a grinning Tommy Pike pushed his way through to Eliza and Colt. He presented Eliza with a crumpled piece of paper. "My bill," he announced grandly. She unfolded it. On it, in Tommy's familiar scrawl, were the words, "Invoice for 1/1 delivery of justice. Total due to be paid in full with smiles." Eliza laughed, a true, free laugh that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Before they could leave the warehouse, Sheriff Reyes approached them. She looked at Colt, not as a suspect, but as an equal. "McKinnon," she said, her voice all business. "The cattle drives will be starting up again next spring. It is a dangerous time. I will be needing a few special deputies I can trust. The pay is not great, but the work is honest." And then she turned to Eliza. "And doctor," she said, a rare smile touching her lips. "Sister May and I were talking. With the new hospital fund we will be starting, we are going to need more trained hands. She was hoping you might be willing to teach a nursing class for the young women of the town at the church." It was not just an ending. It was a new beginning, a set of blueprints for the future, handed to them by the community they had fought so hard to save. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle guest, but as a brawling, muddy, life-affirming force. The great, heavy cloak of winter dissolved into a million rushing rivulets of snowmelt that carved new paths down the hillsides and turned the street of Silver Mercy into a thick, impassable gumbo for a week. But then the sun, stronger each day, baked the mud into a hard, dry surface, and from the newly exposed earth, the first green shoots of wild grass and Indian paintbrush emerged with a fierce, determined optimism. The air, once sharp with a sterile bite of frost, was now rich with the scent of damp earth, new pine growth, and the promise of renewal. The town was rebuilding, not just its burned-down granary, but its very soul. The work was hard and communal. Men who had once eyed each other with suspicion now worked side by side, raising the new timber frame for the storehouse, their hammers echoing a steady, unified rhythm. The spirit of the blizzard and the trial had not faded. It had become the town's new foundation. Nowhere was this new life more evident than at the clinic. With funds from a town collection and a generous donation from the territorial government arranged by Judge Keene, the small building had been expanded. A new wing was added, with 2 clean, quiet beds for patients who needed to recover, and a larger, better-lit space for Eliza's examinations. Colt, with the help of Silas Croft and a few other ranchers, had done most of the work himself. He was as skilled with a hammer and saw as he was with a rifle, his movements patient and precise. One afternoon, he hung the new sign he had spent weeks carving from a solid piece of seasoned pine. The letters were deep and clear, a testament to a craftsman's care. It no longer read simply Dr. Hart. The new sign said Dr. Eliza Hart and McKinnon Clinic. We fix what we can. It was a statement of partnership, a humble admission of their limits, and a profound promise of their dedication. Their wedding was held on a bright, breezy afternoon in late spring, when the wildflowers were carpeting the valley in a riot of purple, yellow, and blue. There were no fancy invitations or expensive dresses. The ceremony took place in the churchyard, under the wide, benevolent expanse of the Montana sky. The whole town was there, their faces scrubbed clean, their work clothes exchanged for their Sunday best. Eliza wore a simple blue dress, the color of the flax flowers blooming by the creek, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked that morning by young Leo Gable and the other children. Colt stood beside her, looking solid and grounded in a clean shirt and dark trousers, his splinted wrist now replaced by a leather brace. The dark, forged iron of the railroad spike ring on Eliza's finger was a stark and beautiful contrast to the delicate colors of the flowers she held. There was no organ music, only the sweet, plaintive sound of a harmonica played by one of the miners, Sister May. Her face beaming with a joy that seemed to light up the entire churchyard, stood as their witness. Gray Fawn, in a gesture of profound respect, placed a necklace of dried corn kernels around Eliza's neck, a blessing for a fruitful and abundant life, and Sheriff Alma Reyes, in her official capacity, read not from a book of scripture, but from a passage in the territorial charter about the founding of communities, ending with the simple, powerful phrase, for the good of the community, and by the will of the community. That night, their home was filled with a deep and profound peace. The town had celebrated with a potluck supper and a barn dance, but now the clinic was quiet, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the fire in the stove. They sat together on the small rug before the hearth, the world shut out, their new life just beginning. No words were needed to express the depth of their connection. He took her hand, his large, calloused one completely enfolding hers. The firelight glinted on the simple iron band on her finger. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. holding her close. They spoke in low murmurs, not of the past and its struggles, but of the future and its simple, hopeful possibilities. They spoke of the nursing class she would start, of the horses he would buy for their own small ranch, of the coming seasons, of a life to be built day by day, together. It was an intimacy of shared silence and quiet dreams, a joining of souls that was more complete than any physical act could ever be. In the weeks that followed, the town's healing continued. The change was visible in 100 small ways. The councilman's wife, the same woman who had whispered so cruelly in the church, came to the clinic with a freshly baked loaf of bread and a set of linen towels she had embroidered herself. It was a silent, heartfelt apology. Other families who had once stood with Barrow now offered their help in the rebuilding, their shame and regret channeled into the hard, honest work of making amends. The community was learning to shed its old skins of prejudice and fear. No one called her the Virgin Doctor anymore. They called her Dr. Hart, or Eliza, or simply, our doctor. The seeds of the future, planted during the trial, began to sprout. Eliza's nursing class was an immediate success. 6 young women from the town and the surrounding homesteads gathered in the church twice a week, their faces earnest and bright as they learned the principles of hygiene, how to bandage a wound, and how to identify medicinal herbs. She was not just healing bodies one at a time anymore. She was multiplying her own skill, planting a garden of knowledge that would keep the community healthy for years to come. Colt, in his new role as a special deputy, began training a small group of young ranchers in the principles of lawful defense. He taught them how to shoot, not with the quick, reactive violence of a gunfighter, but with the calm, disciplined precision of a peacekeeper. He taught them tracking and observation, and how to de-escalate a conflict before it turned to bloodshed. He was taking the hard-won lessons of his own violent past and reforging them into a shield for the town's future. And Tommy Pike, true to his nature, had turned his stagecoach into a local legend. With Eliza's guidance, he had outfitted the interior with a set of well-cushioned shelves for medical supplies. Once a week, the Mercy Wagon, as he had proudly painted on its side, would set out on a circuit to the most remote homesteads in the valley. Eliza would ride with him, bringing her skill and her compassion to those who could not make the long journey into town. One evening, as she was preparing a poultice in the clinic, she looked down at her hand, at the dark ring that had become so much a part of her. Mrs. Mine. The words still came to her sometimes, but they no longer held any fear. They had been transformed. His promise, "We are ours," had become the truth of their lives. It was not a brand of ownership, but a covenant of service, a shared commitment to the people and the land they both now called home. The last of Barrow's men, the members of Red Jack's crew who had not testified, were sentenced to a federal work camp. Magnus Barrow himself was taken away in chains on the morning stagecoach, a sullen, defeated man who did not even look up as he passed the town he had tried to break. And Sheriff Alma Reyes, her authority now unquestioned, her integrity proven, continued to keep the peace, a full partner in the town's rebirth. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Eliza and Colt finished with their last patient of the day. They stood together in the doorway of their clinic, watching the sky turn a brilliant, painted orange. The single oil lamp, its glass now replaced, hung from its bracket. But its purpose had changed. It no longer felt like a lone flame fighting back an overwhelming darkness. Now, it was a beacon, a warm and welcoming light for any traveler, a symbol of the safety and sanctuary that lay within. She turned to go back inside, her mind already on the notes she needed to write. As she picked up her pen, the last rays of sunlight coming through the window caught the dark, hammered surface of the railroad spike ring on her finger, making it gleam with a soft, understated light. It was a beautiful, constant reminder that even the hardest and cruelest of things could be remade into a symbol of connection and love. They closed the door for the night, the latch clicking shut with a sound of quiet finality. Outside, a gentle evening breeze stirred, making the new wooden sign creak softly, a sound like a contented sigh. The vast Montana sky arched above them, studded with the first stars of evening. The wind was still wild, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Wild West. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can all connect over this shared story. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and press the hype button to help us bring more tales like this to listeners everywhere.